Imagine a country that is, by some measures, the richest patch of ground on the entire planet. Not richest in the way you'd picture a wealthy nation, with skyscrapers and highways, but richest in the way the earth itself can be rich. Underneath its red soil sits more cobalt than anywhere else on Earth. Its rock holds nearly 2/3 of the uranium that the West would come to depend on. Its rivers cut through some of the most valuable copper deposits ever discovered. For nearly a century, none of that wealth belonged to the people standing on top of it. Now imagine that this country finally gets its independence. A new prime minister stands up, a man in his 30s, self-educated, electric when he speaks, and he says something that should not have been controversial at all. He says the minerals in the ground belong to the nation, not to the foreign company that has been extracting them for 50 years. He says his country will choose its own friends, on its own terms, in the middle of a Cold War where neutrality itself was treated as a provocation. 10 weeks later, he is overthrown. 7 months later, he is dead, shot by a firing squad in a clearing in the forest. His body dissolved afterwards, so there would be nothing left to bury. The men who orchestrated it were not primarily his own rivals, although his rivals were happy to help. They were foreign intelligence officers and mining executives and government ministers 3,000 miles away, in Brussels and in Washington, who had decided that a copper company's balance sheet mattered more than an election. This is the story of Patrice Lumumba, the first and only democratically elected leader of an independent Congo, and how Belgium and the United States conspired to erase him less than 7 months after he took office, all to keep control of the minerals underneath his country's feet. The version most people know, if they know it at all, treats Lumumba's death as a Cold War casualty, an inconvenient neutralist caught between two superpowers. What that version leaves out is that the plot to remove him began before the Cold War rivalry ever entered the room, driven first and foremost by a Belgian mining company that had no intention of losing its most profitable colony to an African government that might actually tax it. To understand why a single election in Central Africa could trigger an international assassination plot, you have to go back more than half a century before it happened, to a king who treated an entire country as his personal property. In 1885, King Leopold II of Belgium secured personal ownership of a territory 80 times the size of Belgium itself, which he named the Congo Free State. It was not a colony administered by the Belgian government. It was, astonishingly, Leopold's private estate, run for his personal profit through forced labor extracting rubber and ivory. The brutality of that regime, severed hands used as proof of quota compliance, villages worked and starved into collapse, became one of the first great international human rights scandals of the 20th century. And by 1908, the outcry forced Leopold to hand the territory over to the Belgian state itself. The name changed from Congo Free State to Belgian Congo. The extraction did not stop. It professionalized. The centerpiece of that extraction was a company called the Minière du Haut Katanga, founded in 1906 to exploit the mineral wealth of the southeastern province of Katanga. Katanga sat on some of the richest ore deposits on the planet, copper, yes, but also cobalt and tin, and critically, uranium. By the 1950s, Union Minière controlled roughly 10% of the world's copper production, around 60 to 75% of the West's cobalt supply, and the majority of its uranium. Uranium from the company's Shinkolobwe mine was so rich in concentration that it became the primary source of ore for the Manhattan Project. The uranium in the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was mined in Katanga. Belgium's most important wartime and post-war contribution to the Western Alliance did not come from its army. It came from a hole in the ground in the Congo. By the late 1950s, Union Minière was not merely a business operating inside a colony. It was, in practice, a state within a state. It ran its own schools, hospitals, housing developments, and police-adjacent security forces. In 1959, Belgian profits from Union Minière topped insert VERIFIED figure, approx. 3.5 billion Belgian francs, and export duties from the company at times accounted for as much as 2/3 of the entire colonial government's revenue. This was not one industry among several. This was, in the case of Katanga specifically, functionally the entire economy, and the parent conglomerate behind Union Minière, the Société Générale de Belgique, was estimated to control something like 70% of the Congolese economy as a whole. When people talk about the Belgian Congo, they are, more than they usually realize, talking about a single holding company's balance sheet. The independence movement that eventually threatened all of this did not emerge from nowhere. Through the 1950s, a new generation of Congolese political leaders, most of them urban, educated in colonial schools that were never meant to produce leaders. Radicalized by the hypocrisy of a civilizing mission that kept them out of their own capitals, whites-only cafes began organizing. Among them was a former postal worker and beer company sales director from Kasai province named Patrice Lumumba, who in 1958 helped found the movement National Congolais, one of the first Congolese parties to campaign explicitly for full national independence rather than gradual reform. Belgium, watching neighboring African colonies erupt into unrest, and unwilling to fight the kind of brutal colonial war France was then losing in Algeria, made a decision that stunned nearly everyone, including many Congolese leaders themselves. Rather than plan for a gradual, decades-long transition, Brussels agreed at a round-table conference in early 1960 to grant full independence almost immediately, the date set for June 30th of that same year. It was, by the admission of Belgian officials themselves, dangerously rushed. The Congo had, at independence, only a small handful of university graduates and virtually no Congolese officers in its own army. Belgium was leaving in a hurry, and it was leaving behind almost none of the administrative capacity a new state would need to actually govern. What it was not leaving behind, crucially, was Union Miniere's grip on Katanga's minerals. That Brussels intended to keep. Patrice Lumumba was 34 years old when he became prime minister, a wiry, restless man with a goatee and horn-rimmed glasses, who had never held elected office before winning the largest block of seats in Congo's first national election. He had been jailed by Belgian authorities before independence for inciting anti-colonial riots, released just in time to attend the round-table conference that negotiated Congo's freedom. He was known for a kind of electric, almost improvisational eloquence. Colleagues described him talking for hours without notes, pacing, chain-smoking, switching between French and Lingala mid-sentence. He was also, crucially, a nationalist in the specific sense that mattered most to Brussels. He believed the Congo's mineral wealth belonged to the Congolese state, and he made no secret of his intention to eventually renegotiate the terms under which Union Minière operated. On June 30th, 1960, at the official independence ceremony in Léopoldville, Belgium's young King Baudouin delivered a speech praising the genius of his great-granduncle Leopold II for founding the colony. A speech that, to Congolese ears, sounded uncomfortably close to praising the very system that had brutalized their parents and grandparents. Lumumba had not been scheduled to speak. He took the podium anyway, and in an unscripted address he described in plain terms the assembled Belgian dignitaries had not expected to hear on their own ceremonial stage: the humiliations of colonial rule, the forced labor, the segregation, the daily indignities inflicted on Congolese workers by Belgian bosses for 75 years. The room, by multiple accounts, went cold. Baudouin was reportedly furious. It was, in retrospect, the moment Lumumba made himself an enemy of Brussels before he had governed for even a single day. 10 days after independence, the Congolese army mutinied against its still Belgian officer corps, and the fragile new state began to unravel. 10 days after that, on July 11, 1960, the mineral-rich province of Katanga declared its own secession from the Congo, under the leadership of a Katangese businessman and politician named Tshombe. Tshombe was the son of a wealthy Katangese merchant family, comfortable in Belgian business and social circles in a way few other Congolese politicians were, and his secessionist government was, from its very first days, propped up by Belgian troops, Belgian financing, and above all by Union Minière itself, which redirected its tax payments away from the central Congolese government in Léopoldville and into Tshombe's breakaway treasury instead. The pattern was not subtle. The one Congolese province that held nearly all of the country's mineral wealth was, within 2 weeks of independence, no longer part of the country, propped up by exactly the interests that stood to lose the most from a strong, resource-nationalist central government in Léopoldville. Alongside Tshombe stood Godefroid Monongo, Katanga's interior minister, a hardline figure whose family had a personal grievance against colonial administration, but whose politics placed him firmly in the pro-secession, anti-Lumumba camp, and who would later be identified as one of the men most directly involved in ordering Lumumba's death. In Washington, the man most responsible for treating Lumumba as a problem to be solved was CIA Director Allen Dulles, who by August of 1960 had cabled the agency's station in Léopoldville, led on the ground by Station Chief Larry Devlin, describing Lumumba's removal as, in Dulles' own words, an urgent and high-priority objective of American covert action. And in the Congolese army itself, a young colonel named Joseph Desiré Mobutu, whom Lumumba had personally appointed as Army Chief of Staff only weeks earlier, would become the instrument through which Lumumba was first overthrown and then handed over to his enemies. The numbers behind this story are worth sitting with, because they explain the urgency with which Brussels and Union Minière moved. In 1960, Union Minière's annual sales stood at roughly $200 million, making it the world's third-largest copper producer, even as it also supplied around 60% of the West's uranium, and somewhere between 60 and 75% of the world's cobalt. One academic study of the Katanga mining sector estimated that over the full colonial period, the copper industry alone generated total income equivalent to roughly twice the Congo's entire nominal GDP in 1960. Katanga's mineral exports accounted for more than half of the entire Congo's export earnings. This was not a resource-rich province among several. It was, in financial terms, nearly the whole of the country's usable wealth, concentrated in one region and controlled by one company. Set against that, Lumumba's government inherited a treasury with almost nothing in it. A civil service Belgium had made almost no effort to train Congolese staff to run. And now, within days of independence, the loss of the one province whose tax revenue could have funded the state at all. Belgium, for its part, was not simply an anxious former colonial power watching from a distance. Its own military intervened directly and repeatedly in the crisis. And by the estimate of multiple historians, Belgian financial and military support for the Katanga secession ran into the tens of millions of dollars over the following months, a sum that dwarfed anything Lumumba's central government had access to. The CIA, in parallel, authorized funds explicitly earmarked for destabilizing Lumumba's government and eventually for planning his physical elimination, including, according to later U.S. Senate investigation, a poison plot developed by the agency's own scientists and personally carried into the Congo by a CIA officer, a plot that was ultimately overtaken by events on the ground before it could be used. The money spent to remove one prime minister, in other words, vastly outstripped anything that prime minister had ever been given to actually govern. By December of 1960, Lumumba was no longer prime minister in anything but name. Mobutu had staged a coup in September, with covert American and Belgian encouragement, sidelining both Lumumba and Congo's president, and Lumumba had been placed under house arrest, guarded by UN troops who initially prevented his arrest, but who, under murky and disputed circumstances, eventually failed to stop Mobutu's forces from seizing him. He was flown to a military camp at Thysville, roughly 100 miles from the capital, and held there through the final weeks of the year, increasingly isolated from allies who might have protected him. On the morning of January 13, 1961, discipline among the soldiers guarding Lumumba at Thysville broke down entirely. A mutiny, driven partly by unpaid wages and partly by genuine sympathy for the imprisoned prime minister among the rank and file. For a few hours, it looked as though Lumumba might actually be freed by his own captors. Belgian officials monitoring the situation, including Minister for African Affairs Harold de Spremont-Linden, understood immediately what that would mean and moved to prevent it. Rather than risk Lumumba's release, Belgian and Congolese authorities in Léopoldville made the decision to transfer him somewhere he could never be freed. And the two options on the table, Kasai Province or Katanga, were both understood explicitly by the men making the decision as places where Lumumba would very likely be killed. They chose Katanga, the province run by Tshombe, financed by Union Minière, and populated by soldiers who answered, ultimately, to Belgian officers still embedded in its command structure. On the evening of January 17, 1961, Lumumba landed at the airport near Elizabethville, Katanga's capital, along with two of his political allies, Maurice Mpolo and Joseph Akito. He was beaten during the flight and again after landing. Within roughly 5 hours of touching down on Katangan soil, all three men had been driven to an isolated clearing in the bush. A Belgian officer of Flemish origin, according to CIA reporting at the time, gave the order and fired the shots that killed Lumumba himself. Katangese soldiers under Belgian command shot Mpolo and Akito beside him. The bodies were buried in a shallow grave, then dug up days later on Belgian orders, cut apart, and dissolved in sulfuric acid. A deliberate act meant to ensure there would be no grave, no shrine, nothing for Congolese mourners to gather around. It would take decades, and a Belgian parliamentary inquiry in the early 2000s, before the full sequence of that night was formally acknowledged by the government most responsible for it. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of story that tempts people toward a tidy, single-villain narrative. The idea that one phone call from Union Minière's boardroom sealed Lumumba's fate. Full stop. End of story. That version is too clean. Lumumba made real enemies among fellow Congolese politicians for reasons that had nothing to do with Belgian mining interests. His combative style, his rapid turn towards Soviet military assistance after Western powers refused to help him retake Katanga, and his own missteps alienated other Congolese leaders like Mobutu and President Joseph Kasavubu on genuinely domestic grounds. The Cold War paranoia in Washington was real and not manufactured purely as cover for corporate interests. Allen Dulles and the Eisenhower administration sincerely, if wrongly, believed Lumumba was steering the Congo toward the Soviet bloc. But it is equally naive to treat this as a purely ideological Cold War tragedy that happened to involve a mining company as an incidental bystander. The documentary record is unambiguous that Belgian officials coordinated Lumumba's transfer to Katanga specifically because they expected it to result in his death. That Union Minière's revenue directly financed the Katangese secession that made his murder possible, and that both Brussels and Washington moved against him within weeks of his taking office. Well before there was any serious evidence, he intended to align the Congo with Moscow. The mineral interests and the Cold War paranoia were not competing explanations. They reinforced each other, and together they were more than enough to kill him. With Lumumba dead and Katanga's secession eventually suppressed, power in the Congo consolidated around the one man who had proven most useful to both Brussels and Washington, Joseph Mobutu. In 1965, Mobutu seized full power in a second coup and would go on to rule for 32 years, renaming the country Zaire, renaming himself Mobutu Sese Seko, and building one of the most notorious kleptocracies of the 20th century, reportedly amassing a personal fortune estimated at several $billions, while the country's infrastructure and institutions collapsed around him. He was, for most of the Cold War, a reliable Western ally, propped up with American and Belgian support precisely because he was not Lumumba. Union Minière itself was eventually nationalized by Mobutu's government in 1967 and rebranded as Gécamines. But the extraction economy it had built, foreign-oriented, resource-dependent, concentrated in the same handful of provinces, persisted largely intact. The line from 1961 to the present day is not subtle. The Democratic Republic of the Congo today sits on the majority of the world's cobalt reserves, a mineral now essential to the lithium-ion batteries in every smartphone and electric vehicle on the planet. And the same eastern and southeastern regions that were fought over for copper and uranium in 1960 are, in the 21st century, the site of ongoing armed conflict. Artisanal mining under conditions human rights investigators have repeatedly flagged as exploitative, and continued foreign corporate involvement, much of it now Chinese rather than Belgian, but organized around the identical underlying fact. Whoever controls Congo's minerals controls an enormous share of the modern global economy. In 2002, a Belgian parliamentary commission formally concluded that Belgium bore moral responsibility for Lumumba's death. In 2020, King Philippe of Belgium expressed, for the first time from the Belgian throne, deepest regrets for the colonial era's violence. In 2022, Belgium formally returned a tooth, reportedly the only physical remnant of Lumumba's body preserved by one of the Belgian police officers present at his dismemberment, to his family 61 years after his death. The lesson of 1961 is not really about one prime minister or one mining company. It is that when a resource is valuable enough, the people who control it will treat a nation's sovereignty as negotiable, and they will find allies, ideological, cynical, or simply convenient, to help them enforce that. Lumumba was in power for exactly 10 weeks before the plans to remove him began. He never had a chance to prove what an independent Congo, actually in control of its own minerals, could have looked like, because the people who profited from it most were never going to let him try. If this is the first time you've heard the full story behind that one election and that one clearing in the woods, drop a tooth emoji in the comments. You'll understand why by the end of this video. And if you want more stories about the empires that never officially ended, just changed which flag they operated under, go ahead and subscribe. What do you think the Congo looks like today if that flight to Katanga had never taken off?